Well, I'm glad you appreciate it. Okay. Oh, I am having a day. I don't know why exactly. It's one of those days my brain is like stuck in first gear. And I'm sure that that metaphor makes perfect sense to people who have never driven stick before. Um, but my brain is stuck in first gear. I'm just not it's not revving. I just want to check one quick thing. Okay, our next topic is families. That's what I thought. Okay. Um, okay, couple of quick things. So we're gonna finish off hopefully this unit today, and I'm hoping to jam in one more unit next week. I had initially planned for it to be families, but I might change it to education. I I finished reading a couple of books over the Christmas break. One is it's called the Future of Christian Marriage. That's some really interesting stuff. The second one is called The Two Parent Privilege. And then I was reading a bunch of journal articles yesterday um, about marriage, and it just got my head kind of spinning a little bit. So I might switch this for education just because I've decided to completely redo the unit on families for no apparent reason other than I hate myself. Um, so I might we might go into education before we do families, so that I can completely redo this and bring in some, I think, really interesting data, especially the stuff from Melissa Kearney, who's an economist. I think it's super fascinating. So I want to bring that stuff in, but I just need a little bit of time, which at the moment I am finding difficult. And I was planning to work on it today, and then my brain will not start for whatever reason. And so I accomplished less than hoped. Okay, so anyway, I don't know why I gave you the background. I could have just said we're doing education instead. Um, but I talk too much. That's part of the deal. Okay, we ended off last time on this slide, right? So we're talking about millennials, and we were talking a little bit about relationships and just some of the changes that went on with relationships. And just like recapping, right? Rising age of first marriage and rising age of mother uh, at birth of first child. So, generally speaking, they're getting married later. They have a different view of marriage, which we're definitely going to talk about when we talk about families. But it's related to this. Sorry, this article I read yesterday, it made so much sense, messing with my brain. Okay, so sometimes you read something and you're like, oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way before. That makes a lot of sense. And this is what this article did for me. Okay. Much more amorphous relationships. And I think maybe something I didn't mention um, prior to this was the script. So there used to be these very defined scripts when it came to. Do I have this on the next slide? No, I don't think I do. Okay. Thank God. I'm not getting ahead of myself. Right. If you go back to the silence, right, there was a very defined script for how you got into a relationship. And it looked something like, right, you would approach someone, you would meet their family, you would go on some very public dates, you would go steady, you would get engaged, and if everything went well, you would get married, right? And everybody kind of followed this script. And we can think of it as a very linear script, right? Where you start with here and you end up here. The millennial script, right? This is true a little bit for Gen X, but it becomes really apparent for the millennials is not linear at all. It looks more like this. It's chaotic, right? It's a bunch of scribbles. It goes in no particular direction. It's not linear. It goes back and forth along trajectories. You skip over to new partners. It is a real mess. Sorry, I'm being silly and drawing my scribbles. Um, it's a mess, right? It doesn't move in a kind of progression that you can expect. And so millennials have had a lot more difficulty figuring out where they were in relationships, right? There are a lot more gradations, and these gradations are much grayer, right? And when one kind of goes into the next, ends up being really difficult. So, they create something like the define the relationship talk because they never quite know where they are in relationships, right? The other thing, as compared to other generations, again, was true for Gen X, even more true for millennials. Relationships get sexual early, like very early. Sort of this is more pop culture than maybe it is academic. But it was kind of the third date rule, right? Relationships tended to get sexual around the third date, but usually within a month, right? That was pretty normal. Okay, so one of the big things, and this is true for both Americans and Canadians. I guess it's true for Western Europeans as well, but it has a slightly different flavor in Western Europe than it does in the U.S. or Canada. Um, for most millennials, right, marriage is a sort of final step. And again, when we talk about families, we'll talk about it as a capstone, right? It's sort of the crowning achievement, I guess, in a way. And so for most millennials, what they end up doing is cohabiting before marriage. Now, part of this is, it's seen as a buffer, right, against possible divorce. You get to try out the relationship, you get to try out living with someone, and you test your compatibility with them. Now, just from a straight social science perspective, this doesn't really work. More cohabiting relationships that turn into marriages end in divorce than relationships where people just got married. There's a lot of social complexity here. We'll talk about it more when we get to families. But if this is the plan, it's not working. But this is how millennials and increasingly, I think, Gen Z think. Now, I think this is probably in part related to sort of the baby boomer and Gen X device, duh, divorce spikes, right? Both generations kind of saw spikes in divorce and relationship breakdown. The millennials were their children to a large extent and lived through a lot of this. And so they want to avoid this for themselves. So living with someone often is seen as kind of test driving a relationship, either prior to marriage or prior to having children or something like that. Okay. We'll talk a lot more about marriage because it's an interesting subject to me, and I'm in charge. So, okay. So, when it comes to, and again, we're talking about American data, right, from the National Study of Youth and Religion here. So this is all American data. Okay, when it came to, what they wanted out of life, right? The millennials very much were ensconced deeply in a consumerist culture. And for them, basically the good life meant a life of consumption, right? A life of, goods and experiences, which could be purchased, but consumption in some way, shape, or form. Now, from a moral perspective, they're pretty broad in their understanding of this, right? As long as you can afford your purchases, you're totally entitled, right? So consumption doesn't have a moral quality other than if you're living beyond your means. Okay, that was the majority view. Less commonly, millennials would say we should take care of each other, right? That we have some obligation to other people. But like marriage, the idea of volunteering, donating, being part of a community, right? Kind of these were all things that are kind of like settling down, settling down, right? So volunteering, donating, helping people, being part of communities was something they would do later in life, like beyond 29, right? When they're out of emerging adulthood and they are fully adults, right? But all of that stuff, civic life, is stuff that's meant for later. So for most millennials, kind of what their life structure looked like is they existed in institutions right through school, maybe college, university, and then they have this long gap as they go from, emerging adult into adult, where they're very disconnected from most institutions. So, long time, being out of kind of civil society. Most of them, what they want is a sort of middle class lifestyle, right? What is it? 2.1 or 1.7 children and a dog, and a house with a garage and a white picket fence is sort of the stereotype. Okay. Okay, I'm almost a Gen Z, I promise. All right, public life. This is my last millennial slide. And basically, it can be summed up by saying that the millennials, as they were emerging adults, really didn't believe in the power to change the world for the better, right? Cynicism in terms of like, so they're optimistic, but also cynical, which is kind of weird, right? But they didn't believe that there was much chance that they could change the world. So, well, they're social constructionists, right? They think that the world and society is socially constructed. They themselves thought they were impotent to change society at large. And where they were mostly, they were, and this is Smith's language, submerged in interpersonal relationships, right? So they were focused on their friends, romantic interests, families, and not much else. And there was very little engagement for the millennials. Again, we're talking about 2010, with major cultural or ethical debates or the challenges facing US society. Almost none of them had a sense of the common good, right? What would be good for society? They couldn't articulate, and citizenship, as duties and responsibilities rather than rights. What are the duties of citizenship was not something that they ever really spoke of. So mostly, they were engaged in their private lives, and what made them most happy were good relationships with family, friends, and interesting acquaintances and associates. Oh, and increasingly for the millennials by 2010, this was all managed increasingly technologically, mostly by social media. All right. Okay. So we're going to move into Gen Z. Now, I had a little question like, how would you define the common good? Um, how am I doing for time? I think I want to make sure we get a good chunk of Gen Z. So if you want to answer this, rather than me kind of sitting there waiting for it, go ahead. You can write what you define as the common good, and I will come back to it as I start talking about Gen Z. Okay. So when we talk about Gen Z, one of my big sources of information, obviously, the book we've been talking about, Generations, but I'm also going to take a bunch of data from this book, Gene Twenge's 2017 book, iGen. And again, why, the subtitle, why today's super connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, and some other things, and completely unprepared for adulthood, right? So, if you want to know what she thinks, this is what she thought of my generation, right? We're Generation Me, we're narcissists, of Gen Z. She kind of thinks you're in trouble, and she's good-hearted about it. I'll say that. It's not mean-spirited. She really cares. Okay, so why does she call y'all iGen? The I in iGen, right, is basically to denote the same I that is in your iPhone and your iPad. And basically, she says the notable thing about Gen Z, and she's trying to popularize a different name for Gen Z than Gen Z, because she's like, Gen Z is really stupid. It's just like so initially millennials were being called Gen Y, right? Because it was after Gen X, but eventually Millennial took over for some reason. And she's like, we should have something better than Gen Z. So, she suggested iGen, and the I stands for internet, right? So it's in the internet generation. And what she suggests is really a unique feature. And again, especially compared to prior generations, um, is that the ubiquity of the internet for essentially as long as this generation has been around is what's notable, right? And she puts, not for nothing, the beginning of Gen Z right around 1995, 96. which are the first years that the internet is commercially available, which means that by the time the oldest part of Gen Z hits 5 years old, right around the year 2000, the internet is so firmly established that most of Gen Z is not going to be able to remember a world where kind of ubiquitous internet access didn't exist. Okay, certainly by the time they hit their teens, right, you get the advent of another really critical technology in 2007, the iPhone, right? The iPhone is launched by Apple in 2007. Okay, I know I have this all on my slides. I just like to write things. So, the launch of the iPhone in 2007 is a sort of like, for Twenge, and we'll hear about this again later in the course when we talk about Jonathan Haidt, who's a friend of hers and a collaborator. It's a sort of epoch-changing moment because it really transitions, mobile internet from sort of like a niche business interest to a general consumer interest, right? And the iPhone is the first smartphone that's really targeted at consumers, and it takes off very, very quickly, right? And just to suggest how quickly, by 2012, half of Americans own a smartphone. Usually either a iPhone or an Android phone, but there's a few other, BlackBerry's still around, and there's Windows Phone around for a little bit, though those both disappear. Teenagers, right? Around 75% of them. Sorry, that's in 20. I wrote that in 2020, so that was in about 2020. About 75% of teenagers had an iPhone, and for the group 18 to 29, right, our emerging adults, it's about 94%. So this is a very fast spreading social phenomenon. And remember, if you will, right, where we started the course, right, talking about the printing press, and I was like, a century on from the invention of the printing press, right, 100 years, it was in every country in Europe, and that's a fast social change. Well, less than 2 decades on from the launch of the iPhone, basically everybody has a smartphone. So that is an incredibly rapid social change. And the social disruption from this is something we're going to talk about through the whole rest of the course because it has really revolutionized all sorts of things. Okay, so according to Twenge, right, iGen or Gen Z is really sort of the culmination of a constant move towards more and more individuality that started with the boomers, right? We can say sort of, from the boomers on, every generation is more individualistic. Now, I think in a sense, Twenge is actually underselling this. I think the time horizon that we should be thinking of goes well beyond the boomers. And I think we really are talking about a shift that's been ongoing in Western society. I'm just going to erase Gen Z here. Since the Enlightenment. And Gen Z is just at the very end of this process, the most defined in terms of kind of the spread of what I would say is liberal individualism. And I think this has really been, kind of spreading since like 1750. So we're at the kind of, most recent stage of a process that's been going on for about 3 centuries in Western society of growing and growing individualism. And I mean, if you started looking at it in 1750, it would have been something you barely noticed. By the time you get to Gen Z, I think it's about the only thing you can see, right? Is how individualistic this generation is. Okay, what are some other notable features of Gen Z according to Twenge? She suggests that they're obsessed with safety. And this is something that Jonathan Haidt will say too. In his book, I won't write it, I'll just say it, The Coddling of the American Mind, right? In The Coddling of the American Mind, Haidt makes roughly the same assertions as Twenge does, kind of independently. that they're obsessed with safety, and safety construed in a very particular way. Not so much physical safety, though that is important, but emotional safety as well, right? And Haidt talks about this, kind of the shift between the millennials and Gen Z as this huge change on college campuses in the US, where a generation that was okay with kind of wide ranging debates was on campus. And then when Gen Z shows up, people get very offended and very scared of ideas they don't agree with, right? Which is where you get the origins of, according to Haidt, cancel culture. They're very worried about their safety and emotional safety in particular. Um, Very fearful of the economic future, and this is definitely something that, like, talking to students for the last, few years, probably 10 years now, Gen Z definitely has a lot of concerns about its future economically. In Canada, this is like housing, right? But there's lots of other things as well. Um, Super tolerant, acceptive intolerance. We'll put it that way, right? Gen Z wants everyone to feel like they belong, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sex, whatever, right? Everybody should be who they want to be. And the only thing they don't tolerate is anyone who thinks differently than that. Now, this one, I'm actually going to erase everything else because I want to highlight this and really make it stand out. Because this is all, this again, I think is an interesting point, and it's backed up by a whole lot of things. Gen Z seems to be growing up much slower than previous generations. So, we talked at the beginning of this unit, about the slow life strategy, lots of parental investment in few children, leading to an extended kind of period of adolescence. Absolutely. Okay. So, according to Twenge, right, and this is all from kind of longitudinal data, Gen Z is getting their driver's licenses later on average than Gen X or millennials. They're less likely to date or get into relationships. I think we're starting to see the trickle of this onto places like TikTok, right? Because I don't know, again, maybe it's the algorithm. I don't go on TikTok, but through what I see on like Twitter, X, maybe it's the algorithm speaking to me particularly. I keep seeing these videos of like 23, 24-year-old people being like, I've never been in a relationship, right? So less likely to date. They have sex, later and less frequently than past generations. Um, so, 15% fewer 12th graders had sex in 2015 than in 1991. And we'll talk about this. This has gotten considerably worse since then, but we'll talk about it when we get to sex and intimacy. And almost 50% fewer ninth graders had sex in than in 1991. And I'm going to say I don't feel bad about that one at all. I think that's a great trend. Wonderful. My daughter's in ninth grade. Um, I think that's absolutely wonderful. That may be the best news I've heard all year. Okay. The really interesting one, like the rates of going out without their parents have gone out. Okay. Here, I think, and Twenge doesn't talk about this, but I think it's become evident since then that at least one of the culprits here is Netflix, or kind of Netflix culture, right? Where, how to put this, it's so fun to be at home now, right? Like, every entertainment that you could ever want is at your fingertips, whether it's Netflix or Fortnite, or some such online game. um there's so much at our fingertips that we just don't go out anymore, right? Certainly I see it with my own kids, right? I was out a lot as a kid. They are, homebodies. But there's also like endless entertainment on a black glass rectangle, right? Constantly available. And God, we have way too many black glass rectangles in our house, despite my attempts to get rid of them. Okay, so they're also, Gen Z is also, I think, and I have a whole unit on mental health. right towards the end of the course, which is all about Gen Z. But I think they're on the edge of a major mental health crisis. Oh, by the way, these are all these fun markers of like growing up. And what you see, right? So ever date, tried alcohol, work for pay, sex, ninth grade, all heading down. And again, tried alcohol, all the same things, but for everyone, and all heading down and take a big sharp dive around COVID, or the beginning of COVID, because that's all we see. But it takes a big dive here. Okay, so they're physically safer, right? They smoke less. Again, not a bad thing. They do less drugs. They drink less, and they drink later than Gen X or millennials did. They're less likely to drive hazardously or at all. Less likely to get into a car with someone who's intoxicated. Less likely to be murdered. Less likely to fight. Their parents know where they are 75% of the time and with whom 65% of the time. You know why this is? You can't do most of these things. Like, you're not going to get murdered in your house watching Netflix or get into a fight or get into a car with someone who's intoxicated at a party because you didn't go to a party, because you stayed home, right? And I don't say this like to be derisive. I'm being slightly funny, but this is what it suggests, right? They're less likely to drive hazardously because they're not driving anywhere. And again, these are all things that people tended to do when they were sneaking away from their parents. Um, and now they are at home most of the time. Okay, the one thing that interestingly we do see a bit of a growth of is vaping, but still, even the growth of vaping vastly, like is vastly dwarfed by the general decline in youth smoking, right? So the number of youth who have taken up vaping is still much smaller than how many fewer people are smoking now. I don't know if how relevant this is. When I was in high school between 1998 and 2001, there was actually an asphalt pad behind my high school that was called the smoking pit, where the older students just went outside to smoke on school property. These things obviously no longer exist. Yeah, man, the tail end of Gen X was wild. Some of the teachers would go out and smoke with the students between classes, if you can possibly imagine that. Oh, what a wild time I lived through. God, it was glorious. My salad days. Okay. Um, okay, so oh yeah, this is cool. Interesting. Changes in terms of attitudes around things like gender identity have obviously been massive, right? So we talk about, gender fluidity. We've seen huge transformations kind of generation on generation. Okay, so what do we have on our charts here? Percent of US adults identifying as transgender. Um, or non-binary, right? Okay. So what you have basically is, the silents aren't even on this chart. The boomers, very, very small. Gen X, not a whole lot bigger for transgender. Millennials, you start to see it's a pretty big jump, right? If we look at the kind of bar graph. Um, our biggest jump though is Gen Z, right? Like Gen Z, lots of young people identifying as transgender. Non-binary, again, you had more, still not 1% of boomers, just a little over 1% of Gen X. I forget about them because I am them. Millennials, over a percent and a half. But then Gen Z, right, we're above 3%. So Gen Z has really jumped. So big changes. Um, and this percent of US adults who believe there are more than two genders by generation. What I think is kind of interesting here, right, is pretty stable. Our generational cohorts, we have three different time frames here: late 2019, early 2020, and late 2021. There's quite a bit of consistency between like even the silence to millennials, right? And the big change is really in Gen Z, right? Much more likely to believe that there are two genders. Okay, so if we look at kind of rates of support, about 2/3 of young adults, right? So if we're talking our 19, let's say 18 to 29, about 2/3 of that group, 66%, say that they have become more supportive. So this book is published in 2023. Say that they'd grown more supportive of transgender rights in the last 5 years. So a big jump, right? As awareness, I think, grew. And the discourse on, transgender rights came into the mainstream. And Gen Z is definitely much more comfortable um, playing with kind of gender norms than any other generation. It seems much more fluid than for other generations. And we see this reflected in changes in vocabulary, right? A lot of terms that would have been completely foreign, and to an extent still is, for a lot, for our silents, our boomers, our Gen X, and our millennials have come into kind of common use for Gen Z, right? Things like non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, demi boy, demi girl, and many more, right? And I'm sure, you're probably aware because this is your generation of how diverse um, and how much proliferation there's been in the ways people identify with regards to gender. And it just seems that Gen Z is much more willing to play with gender norms than previous generations, right? There was certainly always people who sort of played with gender norms in other generations, but with Gen Z, in a lot of ways, it seems to have entered the mainstream. Okay, I would love to hear this from you if you have a sec. When did you get your driver's license? And this will give me a chance to take a drink of tea. What's that? Oh dear. Okay. Well, never mind. There is on the sorry. Oh, oh, it's there. I don't know. Do you not have one? I don't know why. Maybe I just have too many options. This is bad survey design. I have too many options. I'll have to talk to myself in my intro to method. 31. So half of you got it at 16. 15% of you do not have a driver's license. Oh, wait. Okay. So half of you got a driver's license at 16. Let's say about a fifth, a little less than a fifth of you don't have a driver's license, with change at 17, 18, and everything else kind of falls off after that. Okay. Oh, it dropped below 50%. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. Interesting. All right. Little trivia there. So, in a sense, like you're kind of like less typical. Maybe as we move through Gen Z, you're less typical than what Twingie was talking about. But certainly, less than half of you got it at 16. So that is interesting. Okay. I want to go forward. So, I'm just checking how many slides I have left. Just a few. I should be able to do this. By the way, it is really crazy to me that I have like 80 slides in this slide deck. I caught my own cup. All right, let's get done with this unit, and I will start with family or education on Monday. Okay, so Gen Z and gender. Again, one of these kind of big changes. Um, the proportion of those who identify as transgender has increased most among those who are assigned female at birth, right, or AFAB. Though it's increased a great deal amongst those assigned male at birth as well. Okay, so we see this here, right? If we look at the boomers, right, in terms of people who would have called themselves transgender, there were more, it's a small number, but the number who would have said they were assigned female at birth and now identify as male was basically nil, right? The same pattern essentially followed for Gen X, right? Assigned a male to female, or assigned male at birth is predominant. It basically evens out for millennials, right? Where it's roughly even. Gen Z, the both numbers spike, right? So assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth. but this number has jumped up. And so we see just absolutely huge generational differences here, right? Something is very different about Gen Z. And definitely a lot of Gen Z people who were assigned female at birth are now choosing to identify differently, right? So again, that's a huge change. Um, a huge change historically. Okay. We see the same thing. So percent of US adults identifying as non-binary by sex. So again, we see a lot more, people who are assigned female at birth now identifying as non-binary. And again, this kind of, if we look at the boomers, it's roughly even. It goes up for Gen X and it's roughly even again. For millennials, those who are non-binary and say they were assigned female at birth, edges slightly past those who say they're non-binary, but were assigned male at birth. And then, big shift in this for Gen Z. So something is definitely different, for Gen Z, and Gen Z people who are assigned female at birth, for whatever reason, are much more likely to identify as both transgender and non-binary. And what's our last one here? Percent of U.S. adults identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual by generation. And okay, right, you see obviously a general uptick in all of these, right? More people identifying as gay, though apparently there's less gay Gen Z than there were millennials. Lesbian is this straight stair-shaped incline. Male bisexual, big jump for male bisexual, but obviously, right, female bisexual for the silence is basically non-existent, and it kind of climbs. It's really non-existent almost for the boomers as well. Gen X goes slightly up, way up for millennials, but then that's 20%. So we're probably talking about 25% of the U.S. adult population in Gen Z identifying as female bisexual. So that's big jump. Lots of growth. Okay, again, this is a really kind of striking change, right? The way that Gen Z identifies in terms of sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity is very different. It's a very unique change, and it's one that kind of you kind of see the hint of it in the millennials, right? You see that obviously, I think these changes were coming, but they really kind of like hit with impact with Gen Z, and that's really really interesting, right? Okay, the number of young adults identifying as transgender roughly quadrupled overall. It's increased, yeah. So what's really interesting, it's increased across rural and urban divides. So it's just as likely to happen in cities, right? So like, I don't know if like my impression of the dialogues is that this is like a big liberal city problem, right? Happens in New York, and Los Angeles and Portland, but probably doesn't happen in rural Alabama. But the data kind of speaks against that. Now, this is a broadly distributed cultural change for Gen Z, right? And just as likely in an urban setting as a rural one. And yeah, like we see these similar kind of changes with regards to sexual orientation, right? Gay, lesbian, and bisexual. But again, I think obviously something happens with people who are, assigned female at birth. There's definitely a big generational difference there. Okay. All right. My last interactive element. Please vote. I'm curious. Marriage, how likely are you to agree with the following statement? Marriage and family are extremely important. All right, that's probably all we're gonna get. No, one more person. Okay. So I think what we see here, right? 74%, so fully three quarters of you answered. Um, basically said yes, right? You agree or strongly agree that marriage and family are extremely important. So still something that Gen Z seems to value. Fully a fifth are like meh, neither agree nor disagree, and 4% disagreeing. Okay, so let's see how typical you are. So marriage, long-term relationships, and children. Um, sorry, this should be Gen Z. I clearly was thinking of myself for some reason. Our long-term relationships are all things that Gen Z thinks are for later, much later, right? Um, and Gen Z has the lowest birth rate for teens and early 20s ever recorded. Okay, so in terms of those values, right? Um, do you want so this is our Gen Z cohort, right? US or actually, sorry, this is through time. So our Gen Z cohort is going to be over here. Again, so what do we see? Well, wanting to have a mate, right? A romantic partner. Generally speaking, it kind of starts in the high 80s, and it's still pretty high, right? Most Gen Z people still want to, though there's been a notable dip, right? And it's getting close to probably about 82%. So about a 3% dip. Now, this could be margin of error. Do they think they're likely to get married? Right. Well, back in 1976, it was about 75-ish%. And Gen Z is very much kind of back there. It spiked for the millennials, weirdly enough, right? Kind of hits its peak about 2005 when that first wave of millennials is coming in. Um, and then, Gen Z, more pessimistic, less likely to think they wanted to get married. And here, marriage and family are extremely important. Well, back with our, kind of our late boomers, Gen Xers, it's about 75%. But for our Gen Z cohort, back in 2021, it had dipped below 70. So for the 40-ish people who voted in class here today, right, you're actually quite a bit above the average Gen Z American in 2019 to 2021, where they're like 68%. So you're a little bit above that in terms of saying that marriage and family are extremely important. Okay, and this is going to become a theme for the rest of the course because I just want to tell you over and over again how unhappy you all are apparently. No, I'm kidding. It's out of a place of love. Um, Generally speaking, right, the Gen Z and percent reporting that they are unhappy has spiked pretty. So, okay, how to put this? It spiked, and it spiked essentially across the Anglosphere, for sure. But increasingly, the data is suggesting that it's actually spiking globally, right? So even countries that we would traditionally think of as like the happiest in the world, places like Finland, right? Norway, um, Holland. We're seeing this phenomenon globally. Though this data only shows us, kind of our Anglosphere countries. When we go later in the course and we talk about Gen Z and mental health, we've seen a kind of global spike in unhappiness among Gen Z, and we'll dig into why that is. Okay, and I think this is my wow. Let's talk about that as we go through the course. No, millennials were perfect. We're the best. No, I'm kidding. We suck, actually. And we are full of self-loathing. You take full offense. Okay, good. Um, that's what I meant it for. Okay, so Gen Z and pessimism. 6 in 10 Gen Zers disagree with the statement that America is a fair society where everyone can get ahead, right? So that's bad. That's 60% who don't think their society is fair. Probably, result of growing income inequality. 3/4 of Gen Zers think we should tear society down and start again, right? That basically everything is so effed that the only thing to do is like tear it all down and start again. Now, this kind of attitude is generally more common of young people in general. Right? As you get older and more established, you're like, well, I mean, maybe we could keep the Walmart. That seems to be working pretty well. But Gen Z, Americans have this strong sense that we should just tear it all down. 4 in 10. So this is an American thing, right? Actually, this is much worse in Canada. Um, if you look at the kind of Canadian founders and Canadian young people's attitudes on it, but 4 in 10 Zoomers, I like this term, believe that the founders, right? So our Washingtons, our Jeffersons, our Samuel Adams, the other Adams, John Adams, are better described as villains than heroes, right? And only 36% said they were extremely proud to be American. Um, this again carries through to Canada. Canadian Gen Z people are very unlikely to say they feel proud of Canada. And I mean, it was something like, I can't remember. I want to say it was a significant portion approaching a majority said, well, if you gave me American citizenship and you converted my Canadian dollars to American dollars, yeah, I would be okay with Canada being the 51st state. This was just very recent. Also, negative about capitalism. Only slightly more than half of them have a positive view of capitalism. Um, okay, and they tend to perceive discrimination, right? A lot of discrimination. And we'll talk about this one, especially at the end of the course again. I'll bring back this term. They perceive an external locus of control. What does that mean? They don't think they run their own lives, right? They think that their lives are being controlled by external forces that they have little ability to change or challenge. Okay. Is there a name yet for the generation after Gen Z? I think people are sort of settling in on Gen Alpha, which again, I think kind of stinks. Um, but maybe we'll come up with better names, maybe Generation Fortnite or something. I don't know. Sponsored by Epic Games. We'll go with that. All right. We will see you on Monday. We're going to shift topics now to either education or family. I'll see how productive my weekend is. Have a good weekend. Oh, man. Yeah, you as well. Yeah. My one day to sleep in. Yeah. Yeah, usually on Sundays. But it's also my wife's day to sleep in.